Good morning and welcome to the Foreign Press Center from the U.S. State Department and the 20 or so journalists that are as part of their delegation here on the West Coast. On behalf of Asia Society, Northern California and Seattle, we welcome you to the United States, some of you visiting for the first time. Welcome to Washington, D.C.'s Ryan, Jed, Doris, and Lydia as well. It's been really a pleasure for our team to work with yours. We appreciate everything that you do. And welcome to our Advisory Council members and Asia Society members that are with us in the audience as well. Our mission at Asia Society is to build bridges and navigate shared futures. And we host events diving deep into the critical issues facing Asia and the world. So your tour theme of the Indo-Pacific region in the areas of security and economic prosperity and people-to-people ties is a perfect fit for us. We have a series of expert speakers here to talk about two big topics, U.S. China tech and Southeast Asia. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of Asia Society, Northern California and Seattle. This is a special event for me as a former correspondent who is based in Asia too. All of our speakers are posted on our website, and for this format, we're going to have two sessions. Each session will have remarks from two speakers, and at the end of each session, there'll be time for Q&A from the journalist delegation that are in these front couple rows. We'll have a break in between sessions so the journalists can have time then to talk to our speakers, and we're also going to have a private lunch afterwards for our journalists so that they can have even more time to talk to our speakers. This event is on the record and we are recording, and we'll have until 12 noon for the public portion of this event. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first session on U.S. China tech competition and its global implications. First up is Anja Manuel, who is the Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. She has an impressive list of accomplishments in Asia policy. She's also the author of The Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. After Anja speaks, Mark Cohen will take the podium. Mark previously served as Senior Intellectual Property Attaché at the Embassy in Beijing. He is the Director, previously, of Intellectual Property at Microsoft and is now the head of Asia Intellectual Property Project at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. And most importantly, he's on our Advisory Council. Remember, after they both speak at the podium, they're going to join us up here on stage. They'll have a moderated discussion between the two of them, and then they're going to take questions from the press delegation. If you have a question, you know the drill. Raise your hand. A microphone will come to you. Please introduce yourself and be brief with your questions so we can get to as many as we can. Reminder, we do have a break after session one, and the tip is that Anja is going to be leaving after that break, so if you want to grab her, do so quickly. Please welcome Anja Manuel.
Thank you all. I'm so happy to be here with you for two particular reasons. One is that I used to work at the U.S. State Department, engaged on all issues U.S. foreign policy with respect to Asia. So I'm a long student and great fan and aficionado of the region. I'm also business partners with Condoleezza Rice, who was our former Secretary of State. And secondly, in 2 weeks, I'm headed to Southeast Asia, so you all can give me travel tips for when that happens. Margaret asked me just to give you a little bit of an overview of how the U.S. side currently sees U.S.-China relations, and then specifically what's happening with the tech decoupling. But this is meant to be a conversation. So I'll just give short remarks, Mark will give short remarks, and then we're happy to answer any questions you all have on any topic. So let me give you a little bit of an overview. As you know, it's been very difficult in U.S.-China bilateral relations. Recently, two slightly more optimistic data points. Our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, just had a very successful visit to China. Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, was also there. By all accounts, they were very well received. And those visits weren't, you have to see them as a success, even though there weren't big deliverables that came out of them. This was, I think Yellen gave a really astute interview before she went over. She said, I am here to meet a whole new Chinese leadership on the economic side. We don't know them. We need to be talking to each other, and we need to make sure that there are no misunderstandings. So it doesn't mean that either side is really letting up on its tough on each other policies. And I don't think you can expect that any time in the near future. But it does mean that at least we're talking, at least we're trying to get through our differences. Very, very important. Let me talk now specifically, well, let me say a little bit word. So that's on the diplomatic side. On the economic side, the U.S. China relationship is actually quite strong. So in 2022, it hardly gets reported in the U.S. press, but we had the biggest bilateral trade relationship ever between the U.S. and China, the trade of goods. On the military side, I serve on the Defense Policy Board, which is the chief advisory board to the Pentagon. Very, very difficult. So the U.S. has been trying for years and years to establish regular communications with the Chinese military to ensure that there's no accident. You know, you now have so many ships cruising around the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, Chinese fighter jets constantly in that area. It's only a matter of time before you have an accident. And when you're not talking to each other, small, inadvertent actions and accidents can rapidly spin out of control. So I know the US government has been trying for years to have really positive conversations with the Chinese military. And after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last August, everything that was nascent in that realm was shut down. And it still hasn't restarted. You saw at the Shangri-La dialogue last month, the Chinese defense minister wouldn't meet with the US defense minister. I know that the US government is very, very worried about that and wants to talk. So going from that happy thought to technology decoupling. You know, I said something pretty optimistic about the rest of the US China economic relationship. Let me just give you kind of a broad overview. If you are a US company in the consumer space, Starbucks, McDonald's, those types of things, you're probably still doing pretty well in China, and you're under the radar. If you are in financial services, the Chinese are still really rolling out the red carpet, unclear how long that will remain. If you're in a space that touches content, like our big movie companies, China used to be a hugely growing market. Now it's harder and harder because the Chinese are censoring more and more and more of Western content, even stuff that isn't meant to be very political. That brings me all the way to the most difficult part of our economic relationship, which is tech. And here the decoupling has really happened on both sides. I think both sides woke up about 5-6 years ago and said, oh, wow, we're so intertwined in technology in ways that are in some ways appropriate, but in other ways actually harmful to each country's national security. And so China, it's actually both-sided. So let me talk about some of the steps that China has taken. American internet companies never allowed in China because it just touches right into the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Too dangerous to have social media and other US internet companies operating there. 2, 5 or 6 years ago, the Chinese started moving American software out of Chinese state-owned enterprises, Chinese government, and said, okay, we're gonna have to make this more domestic. And increasingly, you've seen Chinese Communist Party members being asked to be on the boards of multinationals, not just American companies, but multinationals doing business in China. You've seen the national security law and now the new foreign relations law interpreted pretty broadly so that a lot of the companies that I work with a lot of American CEOs, are saying, wow, does this mean that now my Chinese employees need to be spying on their employer and reporting back? So there's a lot of distrust. That's the Chinese side. Now, the US side has had its own real sea change. It used to be that, well, China was the most rapidly growing market for our technology companies, especially hardware, semiconductors, software, everything other than internet. That shifted a few years ago when there became a concern around giving China, and the way you need to see this, there's so many news reports and it's hard sometimes to see how the dots all connect, but here's how I would connect the dots for you. Anything that touches US national security or human rights with the China context, the US is trying to pull back from. So you've seen a couple of things happen. On the restricting side, you've seen the US put in place much tougher export controls. The US government thinks they're narrow. We can talk about this in great detail if you want to or not. They put them out last October. The US government thinks they're very narrow, just on super advanced chips. and the equipment used to make those advanced chips. I could say a lot more about that, but I'll stop for now. Just now, a week or so ago, the US government doubled down and said, oh, actually, the cloud computing we do in China also uses some of those same advanced chips that can be used for the most advanced AI models, so we're going to restrict that too. That's export controls. There's also been a lot of talk, and again, I could go more into this in the question, on an outbound investment restriction. None of that has happened. Whenever I talk to friends in China, they're like, well, Americans won't be able to invest in China. I don't think it's going to be that broad. Mark might have more to say here, but I talk to the US administration about this stuff all the time. They can't quite figure out how to make this an appropriate length, an appropriate breadth, this outbound investment restriction. So most likely you're going to see something very small saying only large language models in AI, only quantum computing. We don't want American companies investing in Chinese companies that sell directly to the PLA, to the Chinese military. So I think you're going to see something far more narrow. And what I say to my friends in the US government is, you all know this because you know China well, that's not going to slow China down one bit because they don't need our capital. They've got plenty of capital internally or from the Middle East or from elsewhere. So on the US side, we better be a little bit careful. One last thing. This is my personal view. I'm not speaking at all for the US government. My personal view is that the US has gone too far on the restrict and kind of try to build a moat around US technology and not far enough in just making this a race. Just run faster. There's going to be a technology competition between the US, China, the rest of the world. The US has done a couple of good steps in that direction. The absolutely best one was the Chips and Science Act that was passed by the US Congress last summer. The big headline is $280 billion for both semiconductor manufacturing here, federal government R&D in all sorts of sectors. The problem is the US government hasn't actually appropriated a lot of those funds yet. Welcome to the US Congress. We say it's going to happen and then it doesn't actually happen. And my personal view is that's where we should be concentrating on, not trying to pull the Chinese down, but to lift ourselves up. I'll wrap it up there and let Mark go. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja, and welcome everybody. Good morning. So I'm going to take Anja's great comments and get a little more granular, maybe a slightly different focus that will show perhaps some slightly different trends, focusing largely on intellectual property and what that means in terms of decoupling and what it means to the countries that you all are from in terms of opportunities and challenges in U.S.-China technological competition. So by way of background, I think we all know this, but just to be sure that we're refreshed on it, we got into this moment to a degree because of intellectual property. It seems like people are forgetting about that. They're talking about big issues of export controls and technological competition and the Taiwan Straits and the Nine-Dash Line and all these other issues. But the trade war began over concerns about forced technology transfer from China. The result was a phase one trade agreement, which was fairly comprehensive, but not only about intellectual property, and it was really intended to be a part of at least a series of agreements. There is no phase two as far as I know. I don't think there's one that's even being discussed. So that leaves us kind of with a stasis of phase one. China actually stepped up to a large extent on the intellectual property part of phase one. There are other things like purchase commitments where China has been lagging, but in terms of comprehensive amendments to its IP regime, its trade secret regime, the technological parts of its foreign investment regime, pharmaceutical and biotech patenting, good faith, changes to the court system, et cetera, China has stepped up and has actually done a pretty good job. In a certain sense, the US is its own worst enemy because the history of our engagement with China and the pressure we've put on China for well over 25, 30 years has generally been that it's been good for China. It's been good to a degree for the U.S., but I think it's overwhelmingly been good for China. And the Chinese system is overwhelmingly China-focused. Foreigners play a very small role in that system. We may think we're very important. We're about 1% of the litigation, 15% of the patents, in some areas less than 1% of the patents. This is a very China-focused system, unlike the American system, which is a little more balanced. So the trade war kind of helped China improve its system and has helped China become more competitive as an IP system. One of the oddities of that, and this kind of goes back to Anja's comments about the U.S. need to strengthen its system, is that some people are now starting to say, particularly in Congress, we've been weakening our intellectual property system the past 15 or 20 years, and China has been strengthening it, in some cases, under our pressure and under threats or actual imposition of tariff sanctions. We need to ramp up our game. So there's actually a lot of legislation pending in Congress now. There's legislation that was just introduced to improve our patenting for software-enabled inventions, which are critical to AI, genomic inventions, for biotech, and a range of other areas. And a lot of that is stimulated by the U.S.-China competition. So in this very odd world we live in, we've not only helped China advance this IP regime, we're also starting to help the U.S. advance its own regime through this competitive threat. But what we see in terms of decoupling is kind of, in intellectual property, is a slightly different narrative than what we're hearing in the media. If you look at the past 3 to 5 years, China has ramped up on its patent filings in the United States and globally, both in relative and absolute terms. I think it's the largest, or about to become the largest patent filer, foreign patent filer in the United States, about to overtake Japan. And the U.S. has actually increased its filings in China, although not by as much, but in both absolute and relative terms. And actually licensing technology flows continues apace. This is despite a decrease in foreign investment into China, a dramatic decrease last year, and a decrease from the U.S. in particular. So how does this all relate together in terms of your countries and what you want to bring back home? If you could turn on the slide here. I want to show you a little bit of my own research. I think this was distributed as well in an article that I wrote with a student at Berkeley. We looked at supply chain intensive industries. And a lot of these industries are based in the ASEAN region. And certainly there's a lot of other countries that want to get involved in this game, India, for example, but also many other countries throughout the world. And if you look at the list published by the United Nations of extended value chain products that are made in multiple locations before their final assembly, and you compare that to another list that the US has prepared, the EU has prepared, and actually China has prepared on IP-intensive industries. That is, industries that depend for their value, for their competitive edge, on patents, trademarks, and copyright. You'll see there's a remarkable overlap. And that overlap, I can barely read from here, but it's as high as 82%, I believe, if you looked at the Chinese calculation, over 50% for the European, and around 70% for the US calculation. Simply put, goods made over extended value chains are IP-intensive goods. Okay, this is not rubber duckies. We're looking at semiconductors, we're looking at medical instrumentation, we're looking at testing equipment, we're looking at automobiles, which are basically computers on wheels. So what you really have before you in the ASEAN area and in many other parts of the world is, if this decoupling or recoupling or de-risking, whatever you want to call it, continues apace, is really an opportunity of the century, in my view, to engage in higher value manufacturing and to create positive cycles where you can have scientists in Vietnam or India or Malaysia or the Philippines who are engaged with semiconductor manufacturing, value add, software programming, and the like, who can also support electric vehicles or medical instrumentation or other value chain intensive industries, contribute to that and be part of a larger technological ecosystem. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that most of these countries, and I mean no disrespect in saying this, have very small and in some respects even immature IP systems. If you put the patent office of India next to China, it would be about 1/100th the size. Despite all the complaints the U.S. has about the Chinese system, its rapaciousness, its IP theft and the like, China has a sophisticated system, well-trained courts, et cetera, mostly helping to build itself up internally. So the real question that the U.S. has to face, in my view, and that many parts of the rest of the world have to face is, how do we participate in creating ethical supply chains that contribute not only to the manufacturing, but the technological and IP-related components of it? Now, fortunately, just to wrap this up, if you look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement which the Biden administration has been promoting, there is no intellectual property chapter. Zip, zero. If you look at the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, of which China was a major proponent, you'll see there's a pretty comprehensive IP chapter that is really geared to supply chains. China has been increasing its patent portfolio in the Belt and Road area significantly. The biggest player, Huawei, in that. So we're entering into another world of technological competition, I believe, that is going to migrate a little bit from this bipolar U.S. China world to a more complex world with de-linked to restructured supply chains. And the question is, what will be the role of the major technological powers in rebuilding those supply chains? And thus far, China has been a little bit ahead of the game. And frankly, I think the U.S. has been a little bit behind. And with that, I welcome Anja up so we can discuss further. Thank you.
Now everyone knows who we are. Perfect, thanks. Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. Let me just ask you one question, and then we can maybe open it up to the group. But you work with so many U.S. companies doing business in China. You know, the CEOs I work with, the moniker used to always be, well, if you're going to do R&D and other things in China, just leave the crown jewels at home. Is that still the case, or because of their strengthened IP system, people can be a little bit more relaxed?
Yeah, so there's always this kind of N-2 perspective. Let's deliver to China 2 generations back in terms of technology. They won't catch up, or by the time they catch up, we'll have used the revenue that we got by selling the product or the technology to be on the next stage. I think that's been a very risky proposition. I think a lot of companies have learned the hard way that China catches up very quickly by a variety of legitimate and illegitimate reasons. That being said, China has a tremendous talent pool. And I think like Microsoft, for example, the Asian Research and Development Center set up in Beijing has made huge contributions to their overall technological achievements and talent contributions. So in some respects, China's been very hard to ignore. There's always this argument when you talk about export controls and sanctions, whether you want to build a wall or you want a window. I think having an R&D center is true in the U.S., that you'll frequently find like Microsoft in Silicon Valley and Google up in Washington State. Competitors want to look at what the other competitor is doing. So I think we're in an era where we can't afford not to look closely at what others are doing. Although I wouldn't urge anyone to transfer their crown jewels into China unless it's like rubber duckies that China doesn't care about.
We're happy to open it up to the group if anyone has any questions at all. And we can even go broader from the conversation about U.S. policy in Asia, anything that's on your mind.
Yeah, please identify yourself too. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Teddy from Indonesia. I have a question. In recent years, China's space program more developed and considered creating a new threat to U.S. security. And the IA claimed China's system could attack U.S. satellite from the land. So my question, do you think the same or not? And in your perspective, giving sanction to China is the best way to over the war between the two countries? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll maybe take this one. So on China, very important thing here. even though I advise the U.S. Defense Department, I do not speak for them. Okay, very, very clear. I'm speaking only on my own private sector behalf. Yes, the Chinese have a very effective and sophisticated anti-satellite capability. And if that's what you mean by space program, there's also a peaceful space program. But the part that Western militaries worry about is that now China, Russia, maybe a few others are very capable of taking out communication satellites in case of war, and even GPS satellites. So, the United States runs those 31 GPS satellites on behalf of the whole world. So that would be really difficult and concerning in time of a war. I know the US is working on some countermeasures and all of that because, this is part of technology developing very rapidly. Now, of course, you have flocks of satellites like Starlink, that has been so useful for Ukraine, for example. And you can see the US moving to things that are more redundant. That's right. And what was your second point?
The second question is giving sanction to China from the U.S. Position is the best way to end the war between the two countries.
Oh, so there are currently almost no sanctions on China. They're very minimal, and they were related to China's takeover of Hong Kong a couple of years back. So this isn't at all a situation like the West has with Russia, where after Russia's brutal and unwarranted invasion of Ukraine, Europeans, the US, really got together to do a lot on export controls, on sanctions. They're not perfect. Sanctions regimes never are. There's absolutely nothing like that with respect to China, and nobody intends for anything like that to be there. There is some conversation in the US about, wow, if China invades Taiwan or tries to swallow Taiwan without firing a shot, what would the West do? And I'm not an expert on this, but I know the Rhodium Group and a lot of other experts have done a lot of work on this. And I think your question implies the answer, which is if the world were to try to impose sanctions on China the way that it has just done on Russia, it would tank the world economy, and it would be very harmful for everyone. You want to call on people, Mark?
Well, yeah, I just might add one thing on sanctions. I think that, apart from the, sanctions, the issue of export controls and how much that would impede China's growth. It's a legitimate question, and I think, as Anja said, China catches up very quickly. So if you deny China access to equipment or materials, it seems that China can still catch up very quickly. And one of the things that is probably the least regulated and potentially the most harmful is talent. So talent flows, there's a little bit of that in the October regulations that Anja mentioned, but the ability of controlling high-tech employees or CEOs from leaving to work for a competitor is very limited under U.S. law. And for that reason, there's kind of it's like a half-built dam. The part of the dam that's not there is where all the water starts coming out. And we see a lot of issues involving reverse brain drain or China recruiting high talent, the 1,000 Talent Program, et cetera. So it's really not a perfect regime. And there's a long history going back thousands of years about talent migration to help competitors.
I think you were next. Yeah. Second row. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anja Manuel. I'm from Hanguk Daily newspaper in South Korea. I have two questions to ask. First is, you mentioned that United States pressure against China actually became the opportunity for China to develop this technology. But currently, the United States government is introducing more foreign direct product rules. Actually, this is also pressuring their alliances as well, especially South Korea in terms of their semiconductor manufacturing industry. So even though there are those analyses suggesting that pressure against China is actually benefiting them, why do you think the United States government is applying more pressure on the advanced semiconductor technology? And at the same end, my second question is, well, when the Chinese government has introduced their Anti-Espionage Act, there were two analyses. One was this law is likely to kind of steal foreign advanced technology stationed in China, but at the same time, on the other hand, there were some analysis suggesting that China has developed its technology way advanced, so they are now afraid for their technology to be leaked by foreign investors in China. Which analysis do you think is more persuasive?
Do you want to take the first one?
I'll take the first.
And then we may have to keep the question short or collect them all, and then we can come up. I don't know how much time we have. You'll keep us on line.
So I don't think there's a necessary contradiction between the two positions. I think there has been a bit of a contradiction in the U.S. between what we really wanted out of China in terms of intellectual property and its legal regime, because I think for the most part, the U.S. was proselytizing, if you will, the notion that intellectual property would be good for China, would assist in its market reforms, et cetera. We never envisaged, and I don't think the rest of the world hardly envisaged, that China would be using intellectual property for its own autarkic purposes, for its own industrial development. That would be a tool of state planning. A perfect example of how IP can be a tool of planning is the North Korean Constitution. North Korean Constitution has a patent clause. That doesn't mean that North Korea has a great patent system. But China does not have a patent clause in its constitution. So we've helped it build up this legal regime, but it's largely been a self-serving regime. And I think the sanctions, the export controls, et cetera, the foreign direct product rule, are really oriented towards particular threats. So they're really coming at this from two different trade-related economic reform perspective, and one that's much more of a defense and economic security perspective.
And I'll maybe try to address your semiconductor point. As your question implies, semiconductor manufacturing is a super complex ecosystem. To oversimplify, a lot of the design of chips happens here in the United States. Many of the tools, the equipment that goes into the fabs that make the chips gets made here or in the Netherlands or by Tokyo Electron in Japan, and then it goes to Samsung, to TSMC, and to others who manufacture the chips, not a lot of fabs here that are actually making chips, gets exported to China and elsewhere to be integrated in all of those amazing phones and electronics that are sitting on your tables right now. So how do you pick apart that ecosystem? It's very, very difficult. And I know two facts are true. Both, the US government is trying to be very thoughtful and narrowly tailored and not shoot the industry of South Korea or the United States or elsewhere in the foot. On the other hand, they are concerned about China having the most advanced chips, those that would go into quantum computing, AI, military technologies. So that puts them in a bind. And I know some of the American companies, especially the equipment manufacturers, feels that there have been a lot of overreach. I know that South Koreans feel like there's been a little bit of overreach. I can only say is, this is difficult. They're trying to get it right. They're not getting it perfectly right. Yeah.
By the way, just to add one other thing, it's just that semiconductor sector is a perfect example of talent migration as one of the major threats. No matter what happens in the export controls, Samsung and others have been victims of talent migration, Applied Materials, Intel, and others in the US. It's not only US and China, it's a global phenomenon, and it's very hard to control.
I think there was a question here.
Okay. So I got two questions. First of all,
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Iago, my name is Jack from Spain, the political room. So, yeah. So, my name is Iago. I'm from Spain, the political room. So I got two questions. The first comes about the U.S. internal stability, politics. How do you think that the polarization, the internal situation of U.S. politics will affect the relationship with China and the technological competition? That's on one hand. On the other hand, do you think that China is reaching the top of its economic power due to demographics, due to the growth that they have been able to establish since the Deng Xiaoping era? Or do you think that they will be able to maintain dynamic economic sector in the next decades? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then let Mark chime in. So U.S. polarization, it's real, it's dangerous, it's only enhanced by our outrageous media system, which spins up, the left and the right. You all are part of the media. And it will make very little difference in U.S. policy towards China. It's very interesting. I've never seen such a dramatic swing in foreign policy. I've been in foreign policy my entire career. It was really a few years after Xi Jinping came to power that the U.S., it was first really Trump and the Republicans, but very quickly the Democrats also thought, oh, our policy is of having an open hand towards China and hoping they get on board with the IP system, hoping they develop towards a market economy, hoping they become more like us, isn't working. And Xi Jinping is a totally different kind of leader. So you can blame Donald Trump, but really I would say the big shift here was that Xi is much more like Mao than he was like Hu Jintao, Deng Xiaoping, the leaders that came before him. And you saw that only a few years after he came into power. And now, I was on the Hill last week talking to our China committee. There's very little daylight between Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans can be a little more hard-edged, but I don't think there'll be much difference there.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Anja said. I testified 3 times before Congress the first half of this year, twice before House and Senate Judiciary, and once before the Congressional Security and Economic Review Commission. And there's basically no daylight. There is one problem with that scenario. It's great to see both parties aligned. I also feel it's a bit of an echo chamber. So the ability to introduce new information, new perspectives when China's kind of the designated enemy or threat is difficult, and I think the U.S.
We're not known for nuance.
Yes, so that there is that element that we have to deal with, and that's why I think it's extremely important to testify and try to engage with Congress in particular. On this issue of economic growth, whether China will get caught up in the middle income trap. The only thing I would really add to that concern is there is this, China does have, again, a lot of great talent and technological capacity if it was really able to unleash it. And that's really been a driving factor for the past 10 or 15 years as they've tried to climb up the value chain. So, it's not clear to me how much these macroeconomic pressures, including the graying of the Chinese population, are going to impact that technological challenge that they've undertaken. If they're successful, they may yet be able to do more in higher value industries.
Let's go over here for a question. I know there was one back there. And maybe if you can each ask one question, because I know there are a lot. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Dominic. I'm from AAP Newswire in Australia. And I just have one question. I want to go back one step down the supply chain and go to critical minerals. So Australia's trying to boost its production and its value add in the area. We've just seen some deals being signed in the Pacific and with Pacific Island nations. I just wonder what your thoughts are when it comes to acquiring and mining critical minerals that are then used in some of these chips, and whether there's a role for third partner countries and how that would work in the Pacific, or whether the risk of US isolationism would then essentially have nations like Australia competing because stuff like the CHIPS Act or export controls on some technology, such as what we're trying to do through AUKUS, then doesn't flow back through to nations and allies like Australia.
There's a great article by Michael Komisarov published by CSIS. He's a mining engineer from Australia who's looked at some of the critical mineral issues. There was a lot of disinvestment from the U.S. in some parts of the world in some of these issues, just as China was emerging throughout the world and acquiring these assets. And of course, coming from California, I think we're the last lithium mine. Although we can't process the lithium, we have to send it overseas, I think even to China to get processed, but we're coming back on stream. This has been going on for a long time. My friend Michael, who's a mining engineer, tells me there's plenty of rare earths in the world. It's just China has been doing this extremely efficiently, and they've acquired a lot of the assets. So there's also a technological edge to this as well that's made China difficult to compete with, because they are a low-price manufacturer in many areas, not only in the actual mining, but also the processing of the materials. So this is Obviously, it's key to economic and industrial security, and I think there's still a lot of potential for growth in Australia. I think will be a major partner in those efforts.
And just to your worry about will the U.S. be protectionist and try to do it all itself? Absolutely not. Friendshoring is the watchword of the day, complicated term that it is. But no, the U.S. is trying very hard, and this is also bipartisan, to ensure that for each of these critical industries, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's AI, the U.S. and our friends and allies, and that's not just allies, it's Australia, it's South Korea, it's India, it's the Philippines, it's friends in Africa, that we have secure supply chains for those things that aren't beholden to China. So I wouldn't worry as an Australian. The lady behind you, I think, had a question.
I have a question.
Oh, and you were right after. Thanks. Sorry, she's had her hand up for a while.
Hello, Phương Thảo from Vietnam. As the U.S. want to build a more sustainable supply chain of semiconductors, so is it obvious to me that they want to take control of the more crucial and the more important part of the supply chain? So, I wonder, how could the U.S. create a win-win situation for, the smaller countries, like my country, like Vietnam, in that supply chain? What is the best deal you can give us compared to joining to a China-led supply chain? And the other part of the question is, let's say in 10 years later, when the U.S. become less dependent on Taiwan or on South Korea in semiconductor manufacture, so what will be the implication for the geopolitics then? Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to start, or you want to?
Either way.
We already talked about the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain to really complicated, kind of your point in the beginning, really long, and involves a lot of different countries. I think there's a huge opportunities for countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and others. You can already see it happening. There is not a chance in hell that the US is going to insource all of this and do everything from design to fab here. Even with the CHIPS Act, which gives $50 billion in incentives to build fabs, semiconductor fabs here in the US, that's a tiny trickle. I think this industry spends $50 billion a quarter in capital expenditure. So there's going to be a lot left over for other countries, and especially countries like Vietnam are in a particularly good position because you have decent relations both with China and with the US. I see this already with clients. A lot of supply chains are moving through Vietnam, as you probably know, and Malaysia and elsewhere, because you're able to straddle both of those relationships well.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anja. Again, I would just add that this is not simply a matter of throwing out the welcome mat for investment and providing some good tax incentives, which the semiconductor sector seems to be highly dependent on. China has had a very strong logistical advantage in the ports, its free trade zones, the kind of support for technology clusters and the like. And much like with rare earth and other minerals, which we just discussed, China, to its credit, has taken fairly comprehensive approaches to this, which means if you want to try to compete with China or even Taiwan, I think you really have to look at the full ecosystem that develops, even if it's wafer manufacturing or packaging or whatever aspect of the semiconductor cycle is involved. And it's doable. It may mean a little more expense initially, but it's doable.
I think you were next. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Blessed Soga. I'm a broadcast journalist from Accra, Ghana, West Africa. So my question is on the African debt crisis. We know that most of these African countries, especially democratic ones such as mine, have most of their external debt owed to China. And part of the criticism is that the West is cutting back on your official development assistance to African countries, especially democratic ones such as Ghana, and it is pushing us further to the east. The question is, should Africans, and by extension, I'm being particular about my country, Ghanaians, be concerned about this increased cooperation with China, knowing that there are concerns from experts that it might be predatory? And also, let me tie that into the move we're seeing by the likes of China and India to form the BRICS and to, create a new currency that the likes of South Africa and other African countries can tie on to, should we be concerned. Then finally, on the issue of technology, TikTok, we've been following the conversation here in the US about data protection and all of that. In Ghana, you have a significant population, the youthful population, using that application. Are there some threats to, having the youth going onto that platform as much? Thank you.
Do you want to take the debt?
Either one. I mean, the debt issue, obviously, it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I think we've all become quite aware of it. And I think with the infrastructure projects that China often acquires the debt through, they're frequently one-sided. I've been trying to observe, not just in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, how China declines to transfer technology. So you're basically left with a greenfield construction project of some kind, whether it's high-speed rail or whatever, where China has acquired technology from third countries, improved upon it, delivered it to a foreign country, but the foreign country is totally dependent on China for the parts, for the materials. It has to pay back the debt, and it hasn't really participated in the kind of ecosystem that I've been talking about already today in developing improvements to that technology and participating in a virtuous cycle.
I'll make one additional point on the debt. Very hard for the U.S. and the West to have a real answer to China's Belt and Road. We've been a little naive because, the West mostly gives aid in terms of grants. China gave loans as part of Belt and Road that were first very concessionary interest rates and then not so much. And somehow, I guess from the U.S. perspective, we feel like we didn't quite get credit for the fact that, you were trying to do something altruistic and positive, maybe a little naive, but you're seeing it now on the other end. And I think for the first time in the last few months, you've seen China think carefully through debt forgiveness and what do they have to do if some of these loans maybe weren't so good. But you're absolutely, I hadn't heard that the U.S. is cutting back on loans or aid to Africa. If that's true, I would be worried and surprised, and I hope that's not the case. But our State Department friends can answer that one. And yeah, should we collect a couple of questions, and then I know we're getting the axe over here. So, yeah.
Hello, I'm Mindy from Taiwan, and actually some of my college classmates, they're working for TSMC, and I know some of them are assigned to America right now. So I noticed that United States actively want to invite TSMC or other companies, semiconductor companies, to build the manufacturing facilities in United States, right? So I want to know that besides setting up manufacturing plants in the United States, are there any other methods for us we can contribute, or also you're looking for, to enhance the resilience of the entire alliance?
Yeah. Let me take that one, and then we'll take a round of questions. There is a huge, Taiwan is so front and center in the United States, in our policy community. We are very worried about your position vis-a-vis. I sometimes worry, to be frank with you, that the U.S. our policymakers are more hawkish on behalf of Taiwan than many Taiwanese. There is huge discussions at the State Department, at the Pentagon, in the Congress about how to make Taiwan more resilient. A porcupine strategy is what they call it. Support for the Taiwanese self-defense forces. Huge support. Part of what you're seeing with the CHIPS Act isn't let's move all of the fabs of TSMC out of Taiwan and then mainland China can just take over. That's not at all the purpose here. I think the U.S. is very ready to stand with Taiwan. The question is, what do the Taiwanese people want? Put it there. Should we collect a few?
We only have 2 minutes. I don't know if we have time to.
Oh, we're getting, hold off.
Yeah.
The last two here.
Hello, I'm Axel from French magazine L'Express. So there are two dimensions in the U.S. China rivalry. There's the economics and the diplomatics, the geopolitics. So, and we have seen that China leading an important effort, diplomatical one, in the Pacific Islands. So I wonder, is this purely about geopolitics, or is there an economical dimension to it, maybe because it's on the road to Latin America, or trying to understand what's going on there?
Last one back there.
Daniel Szabó from Hungary. My question is that how do you assess the EU's role in this technologic competition between the US and China? We are the ally to the United States, or a third party, an independent party? Thank you.
Go first. Sure. Pacific Islands. The United States has not paid enough attention. China has paid a lot of attention when you look at the Solomon Islands and elsewhere. And so I think what's happening is that we are trying to make up for lost time. And it's both security and diplomatic and economic. I think the motivation here is worry about China's aggressive encroachment in the region, less than those islands being important economically in and of themselves, but it's a real focus. It's a very, very serious focus of the US administration. And on the EU, I would just make one point and then let Mark close us out. I have been leading a dialogue with senior EU officials and Americans on how can we get closer, the US and Europe, on technological issues vis-a-vis China and elsewhere. And there has been a huge sea change. 4 years ago, you couldn't get anyone in Europe to worry about this. You know, there was no investment agreement, all of this stuff. And now, I was in Brussels a couple of months ago, and the conversation is very similar to what kind of the centrist conversation is here. I think Ursula von der Leyen has it just about right with the de-risk, don't decouple. And there is really close transatlantic cooperation in a way that I really haven't seen ever.
I think that pretty much sums it up. I just say the U.S. and EU were already quite integrated technologically. You know, we decoupled from Huawei, and who do we go to? Ericsson and Nokia. In fact, Ericsson's largest market is the United States. So it's really quite natural that we would align ourselves, although I don't see a perfect alignment in many areas. I think the U.S. still tends to be a little bit more unilateral in its efforts, and the EU is often looking for multilateral solutions, particularly at the WTO. The EU still seems interested in pursuing WTO-related issues, and on privacy, data protection, the U.S. lags Europe in many respects. And frankly, that's fine. If we have to play catch-up with Europe, that's good for both sides, and I think that would be good for our engagement with China as well.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for coming and for being interested and for learning what's beneath the headlines. And we're just so excited to have you all here visiting. And I hear you're going to Stanford next, which is my alma mater, so have a great time. Thanks.